everyone can hear. So how's this afternoon going? Good. Okay, quick show of hands before we start. I'm David Hargreaves, the CEO of Beyond, and I'm with my colleague Sam Smith, who's one of our account managers. And we're here today to talk about the whole subject of developing a content strategy as part of a brand becoming a publisher. So we've put together some slides, probably about 20-25 minutes worth, but obviously keen to have questions. So if people do have questions as we're going along, obviously happy to answer them. But maybe first off, a question for all of you guys. So quick show of hands for number of people in B2B as opposed to B2C. B2B, okay. And B2C, it's about equal. Often in San Francisco you end up with a lot more B2B than B2C. And other quick question is, how many people are on the agency side versus the brand side? Agency side first. Okay, cool. So we're definitely talking about both B2B and B2C, so hopefully we'll cover off sort of both bases. I wanted to start off just talking about three trends which are important when we're thinking about content strategies and also thinking about brands as publishers. And the first of those three trends, and by the way, there's a number of sort of film art through this presentation, so see if you can sort of spot the film as we're going through. But the first trend I wanted to just touch on is it's all about how and why people discover content. And this diagram is probably a little bit complicated, but on the left-hand side, if you think about how people used to discover content, it used to largely be through Google search and organic search in particular. But increasingly, the way people are discovering content is through a combination of social channels, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, people's interest graph, and also the knowledge graph with Google+. And thinking about how people come across content is a hugely important part of defining and developing a content strategy. But on top of that, thinking about how people are actually consuming the content and where are they consuming it, like on which device, is also a really important part of thinking about what type of content you should be creating as part of engaging your target audience. And then obviously the third most important part is the fundamental change in the type of content. It's clearly not just about brand content. Content can come from numerous different sources these days, whether it's a consumer, whether it's a social influencer, etc., etc. So thinking about all of those three things are all really important when we're thinking about how to develop a content strategy for a brand. Just digging a bit deeper into the whole sort of phenomenon that is mobile usage. And there's just some stats here. One of the ones I just wanted to single out here really is the one on the top right-hand corner, which is talking about sort of home mobile usage. And 46% of mobile usage in the home is for sort of personal reasons. But then the flip side of that is that 54% is obviously for business reasons. So, again, when we're thinking about B2B brands, a lot of the time your B2B content is being consumed, it's actually being consumed at home and also on mobile devices. And a really important point to bear in mind, which we'll touch on a bit later. So obviously there's a lot of buzz around the notion of a brand as publisher. And I think if you think about probably 2-3 years ago, with the first with corporates getting very focused on having a blog and having regular content. And I guess that was the first iteration of a brand as publisher. But I think there's a number of sort of evolutions that have happened since then. The first of which is a brand. Obviously the blog was first, but then a lot of brands now, and we'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, and we've done some research where brands are actually setting up content hubs and publishing destinations in their own right. And I think there's some great examples of that. I think there's also some pretty shocking examples of that. And we'll touch on that in a moment as well. And then the third phase really is what I would describe as, and it's a common term, as a sort of brand as utility. So, one of the challenges for brands these days is how does a brand insert itself into people's everyday lives in a sort of meaningful way, and a way which isn't sort of overly intrusive. And the examples often cited of this, and it's probably a slightly hackneyed example, is something like Nike Plus, and it's not a great example in some respects because Nike Plus is actually a product that you pay for. But in essence, it's a great way for Nike to insert itself, into your life every time you want to go for a run, and encourages you obviously to share that activity, with a community all built around Nike. An example on the B2B side is something like, I think it's Jot from JP Morgan Chase, or Chase Bank, here in San Francisco. I'm sure some of you are members of that bank. But they've got an application which is essentially a utility for small businesses to enable them to keep track of their receipts. So, you could argue it's part of the Chase service, but essentially it's Chase providing a utility to its customers to help engage people in the Chase brand. And there's lots of other examples of that if you look around, particularly in the financial services sector. So just taking a step back from there, we're just thinking about which brands have done a really good job of becoming publishers. I guess it'd be good to get some examples from the floor. Anyone shout out any examples of brands that we think have done a really great job of becoming a publisher?
Well, we work at ModCloth, but we have a really good, great blog and video content on there. So we just redesigned it for responsive design for mobile, and we've been reaching out for content syndication partners.
Okay, cool. So one of the things we're going to talk about are best practices, and clearly, responsive design is a hugely important part of that. Any other examples? Well, the example that I know is often sort of held up as a poster child, I guess, is Red Bull. They clearly have awesome content. Another example I think is fantastic is GoPro. Again, they're in a very privileged position to have an audience creating content, using their product every day, all day, in sort of wild and wacky places. I think the interesting thing about Red Bull here is, and this is actually a paid-for magazine, and I saw a blog post recently which was sort of slagging off the notion of brands as publishers, saying, well, why would a brand want to be a publisher when a lot of publishers are actually losing money? I don't necessarily agree with that notion, because the brand can actually fund publishing. It's in a very different business than a publisher. But something like Red Bull actually makes money from publishing a magazine which is engaging people in their brand, which is sort of the holy grail in many respects. The other example there, and I think they do a really good job on the whole, is GE. This is very much a sort of lifestyle destination that GE has created. And one of the things we were just curious about at Beyond was to just take the top 30 brands and just take a look at them, see the sorts of things that they were doing. And what we did is we essentially identified the top brands through Interbrand, and I've got a sort of list of them here, and essentially tried to understand which ones had a sort of content hub, what sort of practices, what were they doing with it, how active was it. And we're actually going to be releasing a study in a month or so which goes into this in a sort of lot more detail. So I just wanted to share some of the sort of preliminary findings with you today. And a couple of the findings on it, and again we're still doing the sort of analysis on this, but 33% of those top 30 brands have created some sort of publishing hub, which I guess if we'd done this same thing a year ago or 2 years ago, I suspect it would have been a much lower number. And when we say created a publishing hub, I think there's an awful lot of publishing hubs that are sort of resting in peace across the internet that died many years ago as they were created as a sort of big shiny thing, but then they weren't constantly engaged and weren't actively used as part of building an audience over time. So these are brands with active content hubs. I think the other thing which is interesting is that a number of brands have actually got more than one. And again, this is when we're creating these sorts of content hubs, it's really important to think about, okay, what's the audience that we're targeting? and making sure that we're building the content and creating content with a specific audience in mind, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. A couple of other stats here. 20% of the brands with content hubs use them to replace their corporate domain. So again, the two most obvious examples of this are if you go to Coca-Cola or Pepsi sites. I don't know why necessarily sodas have just maybe copied each other on this. They tend to copy each other on a lot of things. But they both essentially turned their corporate web or their consumer website into a publishing platform with lots of different types of content. And we'll talk about the sort of best practices in a moment. But 31% of the content hubs enable consumers to create and share content, so got a user-generated element to them. And the average sort of post per day, again, this needs to be active hubs, is 3.5 posts a day. So again, it gives an indication of the level of sort of manpower that's required to sort of manage and run these content sites. And there's a number of different best practices. I'm not going to go through them all here. I mean, I think the one that's important in my mind is making sure, and the engagement stats are there for all to see. Having content that is, visual, is rich, is not just text-based, is a huge part of driving engagement, as you'll see in a moment. And then there's also an awful lot of bad practices. Again, if you look at this site here, and I don't know if there's anybody from this company who produces in the room, but it doesn't look great, does it? But one of the main things about a hub, and again, there's no reason in the B2B world why a content hub shouldn't look awesome in the same way as in the consumer world. B2B decision makers are consumers as well at the end of the day. So I think the look and feel of it is hugely important when it comes to driving engagement. And what we're doing with all of this data, and again, this is just a sort of snippet of it, is just looking at the difference it makes when these brands adopt, 1, 2, or 3 of the best practices that we've identified. And as you can see there, there's a very clear correlation between, adopting best practices and driving shareable content. And this is slightly misleading at the moment because we've obviously got, consumer brands on the same sort of on the same graph as a B2B brand. But the point remains, if you adopt a whole series of best practices, you are guaranteed to drive social shares and engagement across your site. So that's a little bit about best practice. What I want to talk about now is thinking about, okay, if a brand wants to become a publisher, how do you decide what type of content to publish? And there's an awful lot of brands who create an awful lot of content, but it's not necessarily all being created to a common theme, a common overall sort of content strategy. And it's a big challenge, and we work with a number of different brands, whether it's Trulia or Virgin, a whole bunch of brands working with them to try and develop a coherent brand content strategy. And the way we go about that, and I'm sure there's lots of other great ways to do it, it's not necessarily the right way, it's just obviously the way we think about it, so I thought I'd share it with you. Is really, if you think about a brand, there's a brand agenda, the brand communications, the things that the brand really cares about. And often I think B2B companies are really good at just pushing out what they care about. But there's also, the market agenda. And one of the things we're trying to do here is sort of marry up the agenda of the brand with that of the consumer. And in that sort of gap in the middle is what we call white spaces. So they're opportunities in the conversation for a brand to insert itself and really make a difference within the conversation and drive engagement as a result. So how do we do that? I mean, we use a whole bunch of data. We use a whole bunch of technology tools. We're totally technology agnostic. But we will pull search data, Google Analytics data, Facebook Insight data, data from Factiva, data from Radian 6. So data across all sort of earned and owned media platforms. And really use that data to understand, okay, what are the things that the brand is being most associated with in the conversation, but also what are the things that are being talked about sort of in the absence of a brand. And really use those sort of two types of data sets to then identify the gap in the middle. And it's interesting, my background before Beyond, which is a digital agency, was 20 years in the PR industry. And I remember we used to spend virtually our entire time when we were talking about how we sort of measure the impact of what we're doing, thinking about it in the context of, what's my share of voice versus that of the competitor. But if you actually think about the conversations that are out there, the conversations that include brands are, I know this is a fictitious slide, 1% of the entire conversation. The things that people really care about are the remaining 99%. So in thinking about this, what we're always trying to do is to sort of make that, that 1% wedge bigger. We're trying to understand, okay, what are the things that, whether it's a business cares about, or whether a consumer cares about, as a sort of, as it's termed here, the zeitgeist, the cultural tension, if you like. And then on the other flip side of it is, looking at the things that the brand cares about and identifying this sort of gap in the middle. And this is just an example of, how we, the output of something like this, whereby, we did some work with Virgin, helping them understand within a number of different subjects, one of which was entrepreneurship, one which was travel, one which was music, and really understanding, okay, what part of the entrepreneurship conversation should Virgin insert itself into? And what we did is identify, I think there's like 3 or 4 different sort of high velocity topics within entrepreneurship, which also were shown to resonate well with Virgin's brand values. So that's an example of how we, and the example we've got on this slide is crowdfunding. So the whole subject of crowdfunding, you can see on the chart there, it's a line going up to up to the top right hand side, is clearly a vibrant topic, and is a topic which Virgin is very well placed to align itself with. So that's the process that we tend to go through when we're working and trying to develop these content strategies. This is some work we're doing with Cisco. You've all seen the brand campaign for Cisco, I'm sure, the Internet of Everything. The Internet of Everything is a fairly large, mind-blowing topic, and one of the things that we're doing with Cisco is to help them develop a real focus of, okay, what part of the Internet of Everything conversation should we be sort of making our name for ourselves and inserting ourselves into. One of the rising topics within this whole space is that of the quantified self. So in this example, Internet of Everything is the overall sort of brand story, and what we're doing is helping them develop the sort of content strategies that we should sort of align the content against in different sort of pillars, if you like, underneath that Internet of Everything overarching theme, as a way for sort of Cisco to ground the conversation in real things that people care about, and real things which are really gaining traction and velocity on the web. So that's how we sort of go about developing. There's a bit of best practice which touches on building out the destinations as well as how you run them, and then also just I've obviously covered off how we actually develop the content strategy for brands and a process that we go through in order to do that. So now I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk more specifically about how you go about creating content to operationalize the overall content strategy, and then also how you go about sort of distributing that content to get sort of maximum eyeballs on it. So if I hand over to Sam, unless there's any sort of questions before I do that, in which case I'll just pass straight over to Sam and then we can take questions at the end.
Thanks, David. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm afraid another British guy for you to contend with, so I hope you can understand me. So I guess, as David was saying, we've looked at white spaces and data-led insights into the kind of places where we want to put this content. But how do we actually develop and distribute this content? And also, the main fact of the matter is the white space is only as good as the content that populates it. So how do you bring it to life, and how do you distribute it? How do you run the machine? So for us, it's all about creative planning. We start, obviously, I won't bore you with brainstorming and idea generation techniques, but the main thing that we believe in at Beyond in terms of planning is giving yourself the appropriate amount of time to actually plan properly. So that's the space and freedom to assess the success and the performance of the content you produce, but sufficiently long enough so you're not chasing your tail and building 1 month programs and you have this constant peak and trough exercise where you're thinking of the next big creative execution. So we tend to work on regularly refreshed, rolling, quarterly creative plans. We always start with creative red threads and themes to which we pin our content. So we don't start with executions, we don't start with particular formats of content, we don't start with destinations, we start with the creative themes that support the white spaces that we found. We bake in engagement strategies at the very beginning. That's not engagement execution, so again we're not thinking about where this thing will be pushed out as a first thought, we're thinking about the types of creative content. We collaborate, and we work with, when we work with brands, we work with PR team, we work with comms team, we work with content team to ensure that these strategies are all being applied to the content. The main thing that we try to do, and we term this creating missions, so we believe, again, a white space is only as good as the content that fills it, and a lot of the times this is where you find a big disconnect between the research that either a brand or an agency will produce and what actually gets created. I think there's a big disconnect there. So you'll have great research in place, but it tends to get ignored when it comes to the actual content creation. So the first thing to think about is the subject. We've already researched it, we've got data to prove it, but we need to be empathetic to what the audience actually wants. What does it actually does it resonate with them and their personal values? Will it enhance their own personal brand? Will they be bothered to actually participate in it? And that's a big important part, again, is bridging the gap between research, a creative idea, and the actual output. Part of the process that we do for that is to put everything through our UX team. So everything goes through a user journey flow to ensure that we don't forget where we come from in terms of our research. In terms of opportunity, cost, what's the ROI for the individual, for the audience? How easy is it to engage? And in terms of advocacy, is it good enough to share? Simply, if it's not good enough to share, you know it from your own personal networks. If it's branded content and it's not up to scratch, we don't share it. This is when you get on to creating your main editorial deliverables, so your content assets. This is where you define what this content's actually going to look like. Again, so at this point, we tend to, iterate and iterate again. We test, we refine. Again, we work across teams to ensure that the content is hitting every part that we've gone through this so far. You always go back to your research. I can't stress that enough. A lot of the times brands will come to us and they'll have a body of research by perhaps another agency and a campaign which should be fully formed, and they know full well that the two things don't correlate in any way. And we tend to go back and on occasion we've completely rebranded an entire campaign and repopulated all of the content because of that disconnect. So it's a really important step to go back and reassess what you've produced against what you've researched. But mainly we want to hit these things. We want to encourage interaction. We want to create heroes. This is what we try and do with our missions approach. We want to deliver insight and inspiration, but ultimately we want to obviously create the drive to share the brand. But how do we do that? So too often this is the approach taken. Build it and they will come. This isn't Field of Dreams, and I'm definitely not Kevin Costner, although I would love to have been. So this is often what you hear. We get it from briefs all the time. We need a Facebook page. We need to push it out on LinkedIn. Should we be on Medium? Should we be on Pinterest? If you follow the playbook so far, if you understand who your audiences are, what influences them, and how they connect to your brand, and what's going to drive them to share. So you found your white spaces. The distribution obviously isn't a one-size-fits-all activity. There are two main choices you'll get to when it comes to sharing your content. Are you going to let your creative ideas be dictated in the first instance by an adherence to a particular platform or service or technology? Or are you going to let your creative ideas inform which service, technology or platform you choose to implement them? And this is a really crucial decision. If you're answering number two, then you're ahead of the game. You're developing content and creative first that's entirely platform agnostic. If you're answering number one, you're probably a specialist agency, or you're getting this thing a little bit wrong. So these are the sort of maxims that we stand by. It's an old web design maxim, which is content precedes design. So is your creativity preceding your platform choice? It absolutely has to be. Hit or miss, is your target audience even on this platform? It seems too obvious a question to ask, but one that often often gets forgotten. When brands come to you and say, we need a Pinterest, It's probably not necessary for a B2B company who are selling servers, but you'd be surprised. Compare and contrast. Have you evaluated platform X versus platform Y and the performance of those platforms? Dead or alive, and this is a big part for us. Is it about to be wrapped up, or is it still wrapped in cellophane? If it's still wrapped in cellophane and it's shiny and new, it doesn't necessarily follow that that's the platform you need to be on. And again, when you get to this, if not, why not? Double check all the above points before you go ahead, just to be on the safe side. So taking this approach and making sure you sort of answer these very obvious questions, it's not rocket science, but it frees you up to be able to explore the types of platforms that you want to produce your content on. So it's all about getting the right content to the right people at the right time. It's all about being platform agnostic, and that's something that we really strongly believe in. By making sure you do what's best for your brand and your content, you'll be one step ahead of those that are developing for the latest web platform, regardless of suitability. Staying platform agnostic also gives you the opportunity to test and to test freely each new platform and destination as it comes to life, without the weight on your shoulders of trying to generate content for it. So when you do come to deploy at a later stage, you're fully immersed into that platform, you understand how it works, and you know how it will work against your content. So again, platform agnosticity for us is hugely important, and that's sort of a mantra for everything we do. It's very easy in a brainstorm situation or an idea generation situation to say, well, how will this work on Facebook? How will this work on Twitter? How will we get this across LinkedIn? These are not questions that you need to address first and foremost. The power is in the creative, and that should precede design, it should precede platform. So just, I guess, as some takeaways, find the white spaces using earned and owned media. Understand where your branded content needs to live. Be bold, adopt best practices, don't be scared to take a B2C lens over B2B content particularly, and live agnostic. Great ideas and strong creative should always precede a platform choice. It should always precede an execution in terms of content. So thank you for your time. One of you have any questions? Yes.
Do you think it's ambitious for small startups with limited resources to tackle the content hub?
I think it's ambitious, but fortunately it's very easy. There are a myriad of platforms at your disposal, an awful number of them free. So I think when you're a startup brand, you have the ability to play around and trial with a lot more freedom than most. And there are also obviously benefits to a startup through branded content that we all know, even from an SEO point of view. So I think obviously it depends on the numbers that you have available to produce the volume of content that you're looking for. But in reality, that's scalable. So the volume of content that you probably need at the very get-go is not as high as a rolling quarterly engagement program where you're producing dozens and dozens of pieces of content a month. But I think it's certainly possible. I think, and again, the freedom that you have to play around with the platforms that exist now is excellent.
Just one thing to add to that as well is that there are some really great platforms which enable you to really quickly, effectively curate the content. So if you've got that coupled with the ability to create your own content, and also just go niche on a particular subject, because then you're more likely to be able to sort of make a difference. I guess those are the two other things I would add into that. Yeah, go back.
What if we have different audiences that we're trying to communicate to that don't necessarily share the interests?
With regard to creating a content hub or just in general?
Yeah, I guess in regards to being a content hub, we have a blog that is a single stream, right? We don't have 27 different channels on it as not a colon. So having different types of audiences with different interests coming there or coming from some of these other channels feels like it's hard to get communication out to the different content to different people.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think again, I'm not sure the sort of specifics between the different audiences, but there's I guess there's two things. Is I would sort of aggregate your content around an audience into a single place. If you've got two audiences, I would almost like to have two channels, and then the way that you're going to distribute that content, and clearly you're going to create very different content for those two different audiences, and the way you actually go about distributing that content would also be different. Again, I don't know if they're B2B two audiences within a B2B segment or two totally separate, but I think you definitely need to, it's like publishing a magazine, you're thinking about, if you're publishing two different magazines for two different audiences, you would sort of treat them very differently, and I think it's the same sort of approach from the platform, the content, and also the distribution. And it needn't necessarily be a big overhead. I think it's just making sure that the user journey is appropriate for the audience and the content obviously relevant. Yeah, the back there.
So from a content creation point of view, I'd just like to hear your insights of what is working nowadays, or what the trend is, are we looking at just like keep it a paragraph or keep it bullet pointed, or is it like really have a full story of page, what are your thoughts around readership and how the content, is perceived better by the audience?
I'll pass that one to Sam. The one thing I would immediately respond to that is, snackable visual. Sam.
And hopefully I won't totally disagree with that. Yeah, so absolutely. So light touch content obviously works. It's just a broad question to answer depending on whether you're a B2B, B2C, how niche your brand is. The main thing that we try and do is tailor content to specific audiences and specific types. So to take a B2B lens on it, we really try and get persona-based content generated. So understanding what's actually required for the time poor CIO, for instance. It's light disposable content, it's visual content, but it's information that they can extract very quickly. For maybe someone who influences a purchase decision, say a tech firm, we'll give more detailed content, we'll enable them, we'll give them content that they can take to their boss's desk and say, look at this is what I've been saying to you, this is why we need X, Y, Z product. So we really try and develop content that's suitable for that particular audience. It's a real stage you have to go through and you have to sort of hone and refine, and we always try and build personas as one of our key stages in defining content. As a broader rule, absolutely. So light touch, experiential, visual content does tend to work. It's obviously the easiest to share as well, but the long form quality written blog post isn't dead just yet. I come from a journalist background, so I'm still probably clinging on to that a little bit more than most. But the value in those kinds of pieces of content can't be misunderstood. For say LinkedIn, and when you're going into professional groups and targeted groups, that kind of content can perform far better than something that looks shiny and new.
So, can you guys hear me? Thank you. I'm jumping in for Sean because he had to go run out and do something. We're going to take a round of applause. We're going to take a 10-minute break, coffee break, and then we're going to come back in for Mike. Is Mike here? Mike?